It was an unbearably hot day. The air felt still and heavy. She was walking across the parking lot, sweltering in the heat, when her gaze fell on the car. Inside, behind the locked doors, sat her little brother. The windows were up, the door was locked, and he had not moved. Panic immediately flared in her soul. How long had he been there? Why had no one noticed? Every second could be decisive, and she knew it. What would you do in such a situation? Where are you watching this video from? And have you ever experienced something so terrible? She froze for a moment, unable to believe what she was seeing. Her brother, her little, helpless brother, was sitting in the back seat of the car, his eyes closed, as if he were asleep. But something was wrong. His posture, his pale face, his tiny hands pressed against the glass, as if he were trying to get out at the last moment. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and fear instantly filled her entire being. The heat was becoming unbearable. The air seemed to melt around the car, turning it into a scorching trap. Inside the car, it was even worse, the stuffiness and heat slowly killing him. She remembered the warnings from her parents, the stories on the news about children who were left in cars and never came home, but she never thought it would happen to her brother, not to them. She rushed to the car, tugged at the door handle, but the doors were locked. She pounded on the glass, calling for him, hoping that he would wake up, that he could somehow open the door from the inside, but her brother did not move. Shock and horror paralyzed her thoughts, but she knew that she had no time left. She ran back to the house where they were playing outside, screaming as she ran, trying to find someone who could help, but it seemed like the whole world had stopped and no one could hear her desperate scream. One thing was ringing in her head: she had to act fast, or she would lose him forever. Back at the car, she felt panic begin to creep into her mind, but something inside her pushed her into action. She looked around, hoping to find something to break the glass with. There was a large rock lying nearby. She grabbed it, not thinking about how much damage it could do to the car, and swung it at the window. One hit, nothing. The second, the glass cracked but did not break. She hit it again and again until finally the glass shattered into pieces. She didn't feel any cuts from the shrapnel or pain, only fear and adrenaline drove her forward. She quickly climbed inside the car, opening the back door, and leaned over to grab her brother in her arms. He was hot as a stove. His skin felt like it was on fire. He didn't respond to her screams, didn't open his eyes. Time slowed down as she realized that this might be her last chance to save him. She held him close and ran toward the shade, toward a cool place where she could give him some fresh air. Each step seemed like an eternity, each breath a trial. She prayed for him to open his eyes, for him to give some sign that he was still alive. Her hands shook as she laid him down. She remembered how they taught her about first aid in school, how they taught her to check her pulse and breathing, but her hands were too weak, her mind too panicked. It felt like her whole life had been compressed into this one moment. It was a battle against time, and she didn't know if she was winning. At that moment, her neighbors ran up to her, drawn by her screams. Someone called an ambulance. Someone brought water. She was kneeling next to her brother, her face covered in tears. She did not let go of his hand, not wanting to admit that it might already be too late. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, which felt like hours. The medics immediately grabbed her brother and began to provide assistance. She watched him being carried away on a stretcher into the ambulance, and her heart was breaking with fear and helplessness. She didn't know if he would survive. She didn't know if she would ever be able to forgive herself for not keeping an eye on him. Her little brother, with whom they always played and laughed, was now fighting for his life. Neighbors gathered around, some bringing bottles of water, others offering help, but to her the whole world was now a muffled background, fading into the chaos of her thoughts. She heard nothing but the thunderous pounding of her heart, felt nothing but the fear that gripped every cell of her body. Her brother was so close, yet so far away. Every breath, every moment that he remained unconscious, could be his last. The medics began their examination with a distinctly professional seriousness, taking his pulse, checking his breathing. She stood to the side, as if removed from what was happening, unable to intervene, unsure of what to do. Every time one of the paramedics caught her eye, there was uncertainty on their faces, as if they, too, could not tell what would happen next. Her heart sank in her chest. What if she was too late? What if salvation had come too late? As they loaded her brother into the ambulance, she ran after them. No one stopped her. The ambulance was silent except for the sound of the medical machines monitoring his vital signs. She sat down next to him, clasping her hands together as if trying to keep her own emotions in check. The paramedics were doing their job, but every time she looked at her brother's face, still pale and motionless, she was torn apart inside. The drive was long. Time seemed viscous, as if it had slowed down to test her patience. She couldn't take her eyes off her brother's face, not believing that just a few hours ago he was there, laughing, playing outside, like usual. How could everything change so quickly? Every breath his tiny body took seemed fragile, as if he could disappear at any moment. When they finally got to the hospital, her brother was rushed straight to the emergency room. The doors closed on her, leaving her standing in the hallway, alone and lost. The minutes ticked by, turning into endless hours of waiting. The hospital was a blur of people and sounds, but to her it was like standing in a vacuum. She couldn't stop thinking, what if I lose him? What if I haven't done enough? What if? The past played before her eyes like a movie. She remembered how she and her brother played together in the yard, how he asked her every night before going to bed if she would tell him a story. He was so alive, bright, sincere. And now, the silence of the hospital corridor weighed on her. Every moment of waiting became torture. Finally, after an endless amount of time, the doors of the intensive care unit opened and the doctor came out. His face was calm but serious. She froze, afraid to hear something she couldn't bear. The doctor slowly approached her, clearly choosing his words carefully. We did everything possible. Now he is stable, but his condition remains serious. We cannot say exactly how this will affect his future life. Her legs buckled, and she barely felt her neighbor grab her by the shoulders, helping her sit down on the nearest chair. The doctor's words echoed in her head. Stable. But what did that mean? What if he was never the same again? What if he ended up confined to a hospital bed? Or, worse? Soon she was allowed into the room. He lay there, hooked up to various machines, his chest rising and falling ever so slightly. He was alive, but at what cost? She moved closer, careful not to disturb the silence of the room, and sat down next to him. She took his hand, barely touching his warm but lifeless skin. At that moment, her mother came up to her. Her face was tear-stained, but her eyes showed inexpressible pain and reproach. "Why didn't you watch it to the end?" she asked, her voice quiet but heartbreaking. The words pierced her heart like a dagger. She asked herself the same question over and over again, and each time she found no answer. She wanted to explain that it had all happened so quickly, that it was an accident, but the words were stuck in her throat. Everything inside her screamed with guilt. I didn't think," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You didn't think so?" Mother pressed her hands to her chest, as if protecting herself from this pain. "He's your brother. You should have protected him." The words echoed in her soul. She had always been the eldest, always considered it her duty to take care of him, but now she had failed, and the thought was unbearable. The days blurred together into one big blur. Every hour was filled with fear and anticipation. Her brother remained in a coma, and no one could give a precise prognosis. As time passed, her guilt only grew. She couldn't help but think that she could have prevented all of this if she had just been more attentive. But one night, as she sat next to his bed, clutching his hand, she felt a slight movement. At first she thought it was just her imagination playing a cruel joke on her, but then his fingers twitched slightly. She held her breath. A few seconds later, his eyelids fluttered. "Eric," she whispered, leaning closer. "Eric, can you hear me?" And then he opened his eyes. At first his gaze was empty, but gradually it began to focus. Finding her face, he didn't say a word, but his eyes, full of tears, said everything. At that moment, time seemed to stop. His eyes, so dear and beloved, looked at her with pain and confusion, but most importantly, with life. She could not believe that this was really happening. Tears burned her cheeks, but they were tears of relief. Her brother, who was so close to death, was with her again. "Eric," she repeated, her voice breaking with emotion. "Can you hear me?" He nodded slowly, his movements hesitant. as if he were becoming aware of his own body for the first time after a long sleep. He tried to speak, but only a weak, barely audible wheeze came out. Her heart was breaking with fear and joy at the same time. He was alive. But what was he like now? The doctor said his brain could have been damaged by being without oxygen for so long, and the effects could be irreversible. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he had come back to her. Nurses and doctors immediately rushed to their room. They quickly began checking his condition, his vital signs, carefully monitoring every change. She stepped aside, watching as her brother, who had barely opened his eyes, tried to orient himself to what was happening. His feeble attempts to speak broke her heart. He couldn't speak, and it was one of the most terrifying things she could imagine. When the doctors finally left, leaving them alone, she sat down next to the bed. Taking his hand again, he tried to focus on her, but his eyes kept wandering, as if he was having trouble holding on to reality. She didn't know if he remembered her, if he remembered their life before that terrible day, but she hoped he would know, that somehow they could get it all back. Several days passed, and his condition slowly but surely improved. However, with each passing day it became clear, he was no longer the same boy he had been before. Although he began to respond to her presence, his speech was still slurred. His movements were uncertain. Doctors talked about a long rehabilitation, but no one could guarantee a full recovery. She stayed by his side. Every day, every night, she talked to him, told him stories from their childhood, shared memories, hoping that they might awaken something familiar in him. Sometimes it seemed that he understood her. Something familiar appeared in his eyes, but then he withdrew again, as if floating away from her into distant worlds where she could not follow. But the worst thing was the guilt that wouldn't leave her for a minute. She blamed herself for allowing this to happen. She could have done something differently, could have prevented the tragedy if only she had been more attentive. These thoughts tormented her at night, when she sat next to his bed in complete darkness, feeling her soul being consumed by emptiness. One day, as she sat by the window in her hospital room, her mother, who had rarely spoken to her since that fateful day, came and sat quietly next to her. They were silent for several minutes, each lost in her own thoughts. "I blamed you," her mother said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, tired, but it no longer held the same fury as before. "I was so angry. But the truth is, I was more angry at myself. I shouldn't have left him alone. It's not your fault." Her mother's words were unexpected and so heavy that she couldn't respond right away. Something clicked inside her, as if a long-stuck mechanism had started to move. She couldn't shake off the guilt, but now the pain was shared between the two of her. Her mother took her hand gently, for the first time in a long time, and she felt her heart warm a little from the touch. "You saved him," her mother added quietly, squeezing her hand. "If it weren't for you, he wouldn't be here anymore." The words were like balm to her wounded soul, but part of her still couldn't forgive herself. Deep down, she still felt like she could have prevented the tragedy. But now, at least, she knew she wasn't the only one carrying this burden. Her brother's recovery was long and difficult. He learned to speak and move again, and every day was a new challenge for both him and her. She dropped out of school to devote herself entirely to his care, spending days in and out of the hospital and rehab. Sometimes it seemed endless. Sometimes she wanted to run away, to forget about the whole nightmare. But every time she saw his face, she remembered why she was fighting. One day, a few months after the tragedy, when they were sitting in the park next to the rehabilitation center, the brother, with difficulty, was still able to say a few words. "I remember how you broke the glass." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. He remembered the day she had saved his life, even if everything else was a blur. "You were very brave," he added, a faint smile flickering across his face. And in that moment, she realized, despite everything they had been through, despite the fear and the pain, they were still together. It had been their battle, their long road to recovery, but now she knew one thing: she would never let him go, no matter how hard it was. Months passed, and although her brother was slowly recovering, life did not get any easier. The rehabilitation was bearing fruit. His movements were becoming more confident, his speech a little clearer, but the fear that things could be different, that he would never be the same, did not leave her. Every move he made seemed like a miracle to her, but deep down she knew that this road would be long and full of pain. One day, during one of the rehabilitation sessions that took place in the city center, she encountered something that until that day seemed to have remained on the periphery of her life: overt racism, which, as it turned out, could penetrate even such seemingly neutral situations. That day, she and her brother went out to the park to rest a bit after another physical therapy session. He was sitting in a wheelchair, which creaked annoyingly with every movement, but he was learning to live with it. She walked alongside him, holding a bottle of water, watching as he struggled to control his movements but tried not to show it. She saw how painful it was for him to acknowledge his new condition, how he was trying to get back to the life he had suddenly lost. They stopped by the fountain, enjoying the cool breeze. Suddenly, a couple approached them, a man and a woman, obviously tourists, judging by the expensive cameras and carefree smiles on their faces. "What a horror," the woman began, looking at her brother with a note of pity in her voice. "Poor boy, was this because of his illness?" She was taken aback for a second, but then she collected her thoughts and briefly explained the situation. No, it was an accident. She did not go into details, seeing no point in telling strangers everything they had been through. However, the woman continued, not even trying to hide her condescending expression. "It must be very hard on your family. You are so good to take care of him, especially in your community. You know, such cases often happen in, how can I say, in dysfunctional families, where they don't know how to look after children." Her words were like a slap in the face. Dysfunctional families? What did she mean? Her voice became sharp as she replied. "What community?" She met the woman's gaze, trying to contain her anger. "You think this kind of thing only happens to black families?" The man quickly intervened, placing his hand on the woman's shoulder. "Oh, you got it wrong. We're just trying to sympathize. We often hear that such tragedies happen in disadvantaged areas. You know, statistics." Statistics. The word echoed in her head. Statistics were what turned her pain and suffering into cold numbers, into stereotypes, into justifications for bias. She sighed, fighting back her irritation. Why? Every time something happened to people like her, were their lives reduced to cold numbers? Why did people, without knowing her story, automatically see her family as problematic, dysfunctional? "I think you should leave," she said calmly but firmly, holding back tears and anger. The woman seemed to realize they had gone too far and, tugging the man's arm, walked away, muttering something about how they just wanted to help. After they left, she was silent for a while, trying to calm down, but her brother, noticing her condition, said quietly but confidently, "They think they know us just by looking at our skin color. It's always been that way." He said it bitterly, but there was no surprise or indignation in his words, only weariness. He was only 11, but he already knew how the world worked. They both did. She remembered how at school, teachers always put them in special groups, never giving them a chance to prove themselves. How in stores they were always looked at with suspicion, as if they were going to steal something. This had been their reality since birth, but now that they were faced with such tragedy, it all became even more painful. As the days went by, the racial stereotypes she had always tried to ignore began to come to the fore. The doctor who treated her brother often spoke to her as if she wasn't smart enough to understand medical terms, and she had to constantly prove that she knew what she was doing. Once, when she asked about a new treatment, he chuckled and said, "I think we can do without it. Don't worry, just do what you're told," as if she had no right to an opinion. She saw how other children who were in rehabilitation with her brother received more attention, how they were treated with kindness and care, while her brother was treated as a case requiring a special approach, and this special approach often meant less effort, less patience, as if nothing good was expected of him anymore. One day, when they returned to the hospital for another session, she heard one of the nurses, unaware that she was standing next to her, say to another, "You know, sometimes I think that such families are to blame for their own problems. If they took better care of their children, this would not have happened." Her heart pounded with anger and she felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She could no longer remain silent. "Excuse me," she said loudly, attracting the attention of the nurse. who immediately turned pale upon noticing her. "Did you want to say something about my family?" The nurse immediately began to justify herself, saying that she hadn't meant anything bad, that her words had simply been poorly chosen. But for her, it was like salt in the wound. Her family had faced tragedy, but instead of sympathy, they were faced with contempt, with being judged by their appearance, by stereotypes. She walked home that night with a rage inside that she didn't know where to put. All this time, she'd been trying to be strong for her brother, for their family. She'd been struggling with guilt over that terrible day when everything had changed. But now she saw that the world not only wasn't helping them, it was pushing them away, putting up barriers. They weren't seen as people, but as statistics, as part of a problem that most people chose to ignore. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of how unfair the world was, how people like her and her brother were denied the chance to be treated equally. She remembered all the times racism had been a subtle backdrop to her life, from the prejudices of teachers to the sideways glances in stores. But now that her brother needed help, it all became unbearably obvious. And then she decided she would not remain silent any longer. Her brother deserved better. They deserved better. She would not allow anyone to treat them as the problem anymore. She knew the fight ahead would be long, that the world would not change overnight, but she also knew that she had to fight for her brother, for her family, for all those who faced the same injustice. This tragedy was not supposed to break her, but make her stronger. Once she made the decision to speak out, something changed inside her. It wasn't just a desire to protect her brother, it was a realization that they were both symbols of something bigger. Their story wasn't going to be another statistic that was talked about behind people's backs, blamed on racial stereotypes and bias. She knew there were more brutal trials ahead, but now she was driven by rage, strength, and, most importantly, purpose. A few days after the conversation with the nurse, she wrote a complaint about her behavior, demanding an explanation from the hospital management. At first, she received only the standard apology, but later she was called to a meeting with the head doctor. It was a middle-aged woman with an imperious expression, clearly not used to patients questioning her authority. She sat her down opposite her in a small office and, barely looking into her eyes, said in a dry voice, "We have carefully reviewed your complaint. However, I would like to point out that our staff always strives to maintain a high level of service. Perhaps you simply misunderstood the nurse's intentions. We cannot punish a person for their opinion if it is not expressed within the framework of their work." These words hit her hard in the heart. They just decided to hush up the situation, not to punish, not to really sort it out, but to hush it up, to pretend that nothing happened, as if her pain, her anger, were something insignificant that could be ignored. "Are you serious?" Her voice shook with suppressed rage. "You think I misunderstood a racist statement? This is a hospital where my brother should be getting help, but instead I hear us being judged not by our actions, but by the color of our skin. Is that okay with you?" The woman in the white coat tensed a little, but her face remained impassive. "I understand that you are going through difficult times," she said, avoiding his direct gaze. "But I advise you not to complicate the situation. Your brother needs help, and we are doing everything possible to restore him. There is no point in looking for conflicts where there are none." The tone, condescending, cold, as if she were talking to a child rather than a grown woman whose family had nearly lost a son and brother, infuriated her. "It's not me who's making this difficult," she said, leaning forward. "It's you and your staff who are making it unbearable. I won't let you treat us like a problem to be left alone. If necessary, I'll file a complaint with the higher authorities. I'm not silent, and I won't let you remain silent any longer." The head doctor narrowed her eyes slightly, trying to maintain control of the conversation, but it was clear that she was being driven out of her mind. "Don't get me wrong, we always strive to improve our services, but you must realize that your brother requires special attention and treatment, which we provide at the highest level. But complaints and conflicts can complicate this process. You need to think about what is really important." The words sounded like a threat, hidden behind a veil of concern. She understood the hint perfectly. Don't make a fuss if you want your brother to get help. This choice, to remain silent to save his life, or to speak up to fight for justice, was tearing her apart. But looking at the head doctor, She realized that if she remained silent now, there would be more such cases, and not only for her family. She stood up and said firmly, "I will file a complaint, and if necessary, I will go further. Your employees have no right to judge us by the color of our skin, and my brother deserves better than condescension." She left the office, shaking with tension. Outside, her brother was waiting for her, sitting in his wheelchair. He immediately sensed her condition. His gaze was wary. "What happened?" he asked, trying to read her face. "It's okay that you don't know," she replied, trying to smile, "but I won't keep quiet anymore." Things soon escalated. Her complaint led to an investigation into the hospital, and while it didn't result in any dismissals, the atmosphere became tense. Doctors and nurses began to treat her brother with icy politeness, as if their every move was now under a microscope. She could see the impact on her brother. His rehabilitation slowed, and the support he so desperately needed became minimal. She couldn't help but feel guilty, but she knew that keeping quiet wouldn't change anything. Things came to a head when they arrived for a session one morning and were asked to wait. Time passed and they were not invited to the reception. After 2 hours of waiting, she approached the reception desk, trying to remain calm. "Excuse me, but how much longer do we have to wait?" she asked, holding back her irritation. The nurse behind the counter, without raising her head, answered indifferently, "Sorry, all the doctors are busy now. We will let you know when they can see you." She felt her anger rising like a wave, ready to wash away everything in its path. Her brother was tired. He needed rest, but they continued to ignore them. It wasn't just disrespect, it was an attempt to break her, to show that the fight for justice wasn't worth the sacrifices she had made. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart pounding in her chest, and finally said, "We've been waiting for 2 hours. This is not an accident. You're deliberately ignoring us because of my complaint." The nurse looked up, clearly taken aback by her directness, but then, instead of apologizing or explaining, she responded irritably, "If you don't like something, you can always go to another center." Those words were the last straw. She couldn't take it anymore. She knew that if she left, she and her brother would lose precious time to rebuild him. But staying meant swallowing this injustice and allowing them to continue treating them like second-class citizens. She looked at her brother, who sat silently next to her, and felt her heart clench in pain. He deserved better. Their family deserved better. And if the world wasn't ready to give it to them, she would fight for it, even if it cost her everything. "We're leaving," she said firmly, "and I'm going to make sure people know how you treat patients here. We're not statistics, and I won't let you treat us like a problem to be brushed aside." She pushed her brother's wheelchair out the door, feeling a fire burning in her soul. This was not just their fight, but a fight for all those who faced racial discrimination, whose lives were devalued because of the color of their skin. They walked out of the hospital, and the cold air hit their faces, bringing with it a new sense of freedom. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear: she would no longer remain silent. After the day she took her brother out of the hospital, her life began to crumble under the weight of her own choices. She thought that fighting for justice would give her strength, that her confidence would lead to change, but the reality was much harsher. Every step she took brought new obstacles, and the harder she tried to cope with this fight, the more the world pressed down on her, making her feel helpless. At first, they thought things would get better. She found a new clinic that promised care and understanding, where the doctors seemed less judgmental. But from the start, something was wrong. Her brother began complaining of joint pain that hadn't been there before. He felt tired even after short physical therapy sessions, and his mood was rapidly deteriorating. She tried to believe that these were temporary difficulties, that everything would get better, but deep down, there was a nagging feeling that something was wrong. One night, when she again heard her brother groaning in pain in his sleep, she decided it was time to find answers. In the morning, she went to the doctors at the new clinic, demanding a detailed explanation of why his condition was worsening, but she was met with the same cold, indifferent tone as at the previous hospital. "You have to understand," the doctor said, adjusting his glasses and not looking her in the eye. "Your brother is a difficult case. Rehabilitation can take years, and deterioration is part of the process. We do everything we can, but sometimes we have to accept that there may not be any improvement. The words pierced her like a knife in the heart. It may not get better. Everything she had fought for seemed to be crumbling before her eyes. She couldn't accept that her brother, a little boy full of life and hope, might now remain in a wheelchair forever. But every time she tried to raise the issue, she was told the same thing: that's life. There's nothing you can do. She tried to hide her pain from her brother so as not to scare him, but he felt her every movement, every breath. He himself became more withdrawn and sad. Before, he tried to joke, tried to support her, but now he was silent more and more often, looking out the window at the other children running around the yard, kicking a ball. It hurt him to realize that his life could have been the same if everything had gone differently on that fateful day when he found himself locked in the car. With each passing day their despair grew. She began to feel trapped. Day after day they lived in anticipation of improvement, but there was no progress. Her heart was breaking at the thought that she had failed her brother. He was suffering, and despite her efforts, despite her struggle, nothing changed. She saw how his smile faded, how with each passing day he believed less and less in the possibility of recovery. One evening, when they returned home after a particularly difficult day at the clinic, where the doctors again gave no encouraging news, her brother suddenly spoke up. "What if that's all?" he asked quietly, looking straight ahead, avoiding her gaze. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to hold back her tears, sensing that this would be a difficult conversation. "Maybe I'll never be able to walk again," he continued. "Maybe this is my life now. You try so hard. But what if nothing changes?" These words came as a bolt from the blue. She didn't know what to say. Everything she had done was so that he wouldn't feel this despair, so that he wouldn't give up. But now that he had voiced his fears, her own fears came alive with renewed vigor. She wanted to hug him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but she knew that he would sense the lie in her words. "Don't say that," she whispered, barely audible. "We'll find a way. We won't give up." "What if I've already given up?" His voice was shaking. His eyes were shining with tears. "You don't understand what it's like. Every day is a struggle. I don't feel human anymore. I don't want to live like this anymore." These words tore her heart apart. Her brother, this little boy with whom she had endured so much, with whom she had fought for every step, now wanted to give up himself. She could not bear it, but she understood that she had no right to ignore his feelings. She sat down next to him, hugged him, pressing him to herself. "I'm here," she whispered, holding back tears. "I'll always be here. Even if you feel like you're struggling, I'll never leave. We'll get through this. You're my brother, and I'll never let you be alone in this fight." He cried, and his tears fell on her shoulder as she held him in her arms. It was a moment of absolute desperation and love, when she realized that the fight they were fighting was not only with the world, but with themselves. After that conversation, everything changed. Her brother became even more withdrawn. He began to refuse rehabilitation sessions, saying there was no point. She watched him fade, his once vital eyes becoming empty. She tried to persuade him to return to his studies, but each time she was met with the same thing: "It's all useless. I don't want it anymore." She was at her wits' end. All her strength was spent trying to support her brother, but the more she tried, the further he moved away from her. His smile was gone. His life became an endless series of monotonous days. He didn't want to fight anymore, and it was killing her. One day, when she came home from work, her heart sank. Her brother was not in his room. The stroller was still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. She ran around the house, calling his name, but there was no answer. An alarm started ringing in her head. She ran outside, looking around. At that moment, she panicked. She found him at an abandoned swimming pool not far from their house. He was sitting on the very edge, his legs dangling over the edge, looking into the murky water. His heart sank in his chest as she approached him. He didn't even turn his head when he heard her footsteps. "What are you doing?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. He was silent for a long time before quietly answering, "I'm wondering if I should jump." These words struck her like lightning. Everything inside her broke off. She slowly sank down next to him, not daring to touch his shoulder, but her voice trembled treacherously. You can't. I can't cope without you." He continued to look into the water, avoiding her gaze. "And are you coping with it now? I don't feel alive anymore. Every day is pain. I don't see the point anymore. Why are you making me live like this?" "Because I love you," she whispered, barely holding back tears. "Because I can't lose you. You're my brother, and I need you. Please don't do this." She looked at him, hoping to see a glimmer of understanding in his eyes, but he continued to sit on the edge, as if weighing his fate. Her despair grew. She did not know what to do. "You have no idea what it's like," he finally said, "to feel every day that you're not who you were anymore. Every day to see everyone around you go on with their lives and you're left behind." "I can imagine," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks, "because I see you suffering, and I'm suffering with you. But we can get through this. I won't let you go." When they returned home from that heartbreaking evening by the pool, life was never the same for their family. Her brother was still struggling with the idea that his life had lost its meaning, and she couldn't stop thinking about how society had played a role in putting him in this situation. And it wasn't just a struggle with physical trauma, it was a struggle with the feeling that they were prisoners of their skin color, their social status. In their world, where black children's lives were often treated as secondary, every mistake they made, every problem they had, was magnified. Shortly after the incident at the pool, something happened in their neighborhood that made her take a broader view. On the school grounds where her brother used to run around the soccer field, an incident occurred. Several black children were roughly detained by police officers after complaining of suspicious behavior. She had heard from neighbors how the boys were simply playing basketball when someone called the police, assuming they were disturbing the peace. The police, without understanding, immediately handcuffed them. Their faces, full of fear and humiliation, appeared on all the local news channels. Her brother was watching it on TV and she saw his gaze change, the pain and anger flashing in his eyes. "That's what they see when they look at us," he said, lowering his head. "It doesn't matter that I'm disabled, that I'm no longer a threat to their world. I'm still a problem, a threat to them." She felt a lump rise in her throat. It was another blow. Even in his helpless state, he knew that racism continued to follow them everywhere, as if his condition after the accident was not the only obstacle in his life. Now every step, every attempt to reclaim his former life ran into barriers erected by racial stereotypes. She remembered how, as a child, their mother always said, "You have to be better. You have to work twice as hard because you will always be judged by the color of your skin." Those words always hung over their lives like a black cloud, but as a young girl, she didn't realize how deeply that truth would permeate their reality. Back then, on the day her brother was locked in the car, she had hoped it was just a tragic coincidence. But now, seeing him suffer from the constant awareness of his otherness in the eyes of society, she realized that their world was a trap from which there was no escape, no matter how hard they tried. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, her brother began talking again about how he felt invisible to the world. "When I was healthy, they were afraid of me because I was a black boy," he said, lying in his bed and staring at the ceiling. "Now they pity me because I'm a disabled black boy. But either way, I'm a problem, either a potential criminal or an object of pity. No one sees me for who I really am." She didn't know how to comfort him, how to explain that his pain was justified, that he had a right to be angry and disappointed. But what could change a society that had long ago determined who was a threat and who wasn't? Her words about "everything will get better" sounded increasingly meaningless, because she herself was beginning to lose faith in it. A few weeks after the incident with the detention of black children, a wave of protests began in their neighborhood. People were tired of their voices being ignored, that their children were subjected to systematic violence and humiliation. The streets filled with people with signs "Black Lives Matter," "We are not silent," and "Enough." The protests had shaken up the entire community, and she felt like this was a chance to give her brother hope. She invited him to join the protests, but his reaction surprised her. "I can't even leave my house without feeling helpless," he said. "What will this protest change? They don't hear us. We've been screaming for years, and they just keep turning a blind eye. Do you think they'll hear us now?" Her brother was full of despair. There was no faith in his eyes that anything could change. and it tore at her soul. She tried to explain to him that the protests could be the beginning of something bigger, that this movement was supported all over the country, that people were finally talking about what had been hushed up for a long time. But his faded eyes said something else. He no longer believed in the future. She decided to go to the protest herself, despite his refusal. As she walked out onto the street, surrounded by hundreds of people loudly chanting slogans about equality and justice, she felt a wave of strength and unity. This was not just a march, it was a cry from the heart, a collective despair, a desire to change an unjust world. The people who surrounded her were of different ages, different skin colors, but they were all united by one goal: to achieve justice. But something went wrong during the march. The police officers monitoring the protest began to move closer to the crowd. They began to set up barricades, blocking the streets where the protesters were walking. She saw the tension rising, people getting restless, and then a deafening shot rang out in the air. Panic instantly engulfed the crowd. People ran in different directions, trying to take cover, and she was left standing in the middle of the chaos, stunned. Someone grabbed her arm, trying to pull her along, but she couldn't move. In that moment, she realized that the fear they lived with every day had reared its head again. This wasn't just a protest, it was a fight for their lives, for her brother, for all those who couldn't remain silent any longer. She felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but not from fear, from anger. After this incident, the news was filled with headlines about unrest, about violence from protesters, about the need for stricter security measures. No one talked about the reasons for the protests. No one mentioned those who had suffered discrimination for years. History was repeating itself. They were trying to drown out the voices of those who were screaming for justice. When she returned home, her brother was sitting in front of the television, silently watching footage of the protests. His face was tense, but he said nothing. It was only when she walked into the room that he finally looked up. "See," he said quietly, "we scream, and they continue to ignore us. No matter how many times we take to the streets, we are still a problem to be suppressed." She couldn't argue. In that moment, she felt the world crumbling around them, every step they took forward pushing them back. Racism wasn't just a thing, it was a system that was suffocating them at every turn. She saw it in her brother's eyes, in his refusal to believe in the future. She saw it in her own reflection, in her powerlessness in the face of injustice. Despite all this, she couldn't afford to give up. Her brother was right, they were screaming and they weren't being heard. But if they stopped screaming, the system would finally win. She realized that their fight wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for their voices to finally be heard. Knowing that the fight for justice would not end until they were heard became her greatest motivation. She knew that if she wanted to help her brother and others who suffered from racism and systemic discrimination, she needed to be a voice for change. But how? How to awaken hope in his heart when the world around them was so dark and oppressive? The next morning, as she gathered her thoughts, she decided that they needed to do more than just protest, but to organize something more meaningful. She remembered a local initiative aimed at supporting Black families that held monthly meetings. These meetings would be a good opportunity for her brother, and for both of them, to learn about others who were going through similar challenges, to share experiences, and to support each other. When she proposed the idea to her brother, his reaction was mixed. "Why do I need this?" he said, pursing his lips. "I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me. I don't want to be compared to others who are going through the same difficulties. I just want everything to go back to how it was." "But you're not alone," she insisted, her voice shaking with emotion. "We can find strength in each other. It's not just about pity, it's about understanding, about finding people who know what we're going through. It's about knowing we're not alone in this fight." Despite his reluctance, she felt it was a necessary step. She signed up for a meeting and convinced her brother to come with her, promising that they would simply listen and share their stories. In fact, she hoped that at least talking to other people would inspire him and give him a modicum of hope. When they arrived at the meeting, the atmosphere was charged with emotion and anticipation. About 30 people, most of them Black, were gathered in a small, light-filled room. A table with refreshments was set up in the corner of the room, and the walls were decorated with posters calling for justice and equality. The people present exchanged glances and smiles, creating an atmosphere of understanding and support. But her brother remained tense. He sat on the edge of his chair and looked around at the people, as if assessing whether there was anyone among them who truly understood what he was going through. She sensed his discomfort, but knew that perhaps he just needed time to settle in. The group's leader, a woman named Lena, began the meeting with a personal story. She told of her son, who found himself in a predicament when he was stopped by the police for suspicious behavior while he was simply going to the store to buy milk. The incident had a profound impact on her family and showed how deeply racism permeates their daily lives. Lena continued to share her experiences and how important it is to be together, to support each other in these difficult times. Her words began to pierce her brother's heart. He finally raised his head and began to listen more attentively. As the time came to share stories, she felt her brother open up more. He began to talk about how difficult life had been for him since his injury, how isolated and unwanted he felt, and although he still spoke with bitterness, his voice gradually became more confident. Echoes of understanding and empathy began to emerge around him, and this gave him strength. After the meeting, he and his brother went outside, and he was no longer the depressed boy who had come here. A light lit up in his eyes, and he said, "I don't know how it happened, but I feel better. I don't feel so alone. They have their own stories, their own pains. I can't say that everything will be fine, but maybe this is a step in the right direction." Her heart filled with hope. She knew that this was only the beginning of their journey, and that there would be many difficulties ahead, but they had finally taken a step toward healing. This meeting showed that they were not alone, that their pain and their struggle were part of something bigger. Over time, their meetings became regular. Each time, they encountered new stories that made them think about their place in the world, and how racism continued to impact their lives. She felt their communities coming together, and it gave her the strength to continue the fight. But the world outside these meetings continued to make itself felt. A few months passed, and the country was again in the throes of scandal when a video of a black teenager being brutally detained made headlines. The incident sparked outrage and protests across the country, and, like before, her brother was once again caught up in the unrest. "It's endless," he said, looking at the screen. "It's the same every time. They kill us, and we keep fighting, as if that's going to change anything." "It will," she countered, feeling the anger rising in her chest. "If we stop talking, if we shut up, then they'll win. We have to keep going. We have to be here for each other, even if they try to stop us." But he fell silent again. He continued to stare at the screen, and she saw his hope fading again. She understood how he felt. He was tired of the constant fighting, of the incessant violence and hatred, tired of everything they did seeming useless. She didn't know how to help him, but she knew one thing: they had to keep going. Even when things seemed hopeless, they had to be part of a movement so their voices wouldn't be silenced. Her brother had to understand that they could change the world if they worked together. That same night, she opened the internet again and saw that a new protest was being organized in their city. It was an event not only for the rights of black people, but also for people with disabilities. She quickly wrote to her brother, "We must go to this protest. This is an opportunity to be heard, to show that we are together." He didn't respond, but she saw his face light up when he read her message. There was that same twinkle in his eye that she'd seen in meetings. "Maybe this is what we need," he finally said. "Maybe I'm not alone, and this fight really does make sense." They both knew there would be many obstacles ahead, but this protest became a symbol of hope for them. Hope that their voices would be heard, that their fight for justice would be part of something bigger. On the day of the protest, they arrived early, with signs and a hopeful mood. Hundreds of people gathered to express their discontent and demands for justice. It was a moment when they both felt part of something grand, powerful and unceasing. And when the protest began, their hearts filled with a sense of unity. This wasn't just about racism, it was a fight for all those who suffer from oppression. And in that moment they realized that their story mattered. With every slogan, with every cry, They became part of a story that was written with blood and tears, but also with hope and determination. As the protest began, the atmosphere was charged with emotion and energy. The crowd chanted slogans, creating an incredible sense of unity. Hundreds of people held signs that read, "We demand justice," "Listen to us," and "Black Lives Matter." She stood next to her brother, feeling his hand squeeze hers. His tension gradually eased, and she noticed that he was starting to smile. It felt like a long-awaited awakening of hope. But just as they felt the surge of energy, there was a sharp crack. Tension filled the air as the crowd began to shift to one side. Policemen appeared on the horizon with shields and batons, their faces covered by helmets. It was the moment when the world was once again confronted with a harsh reality. She turned to her brother and saw that his face had gone pale again. The grip of his hand on her wrist was painful. She knew that this could be the beginning of something terrible. The protesters were beginning to panic and there was unrest in the crowd. People were pushing and shoving and trying to find a way out. "We mustn't panic," she shouted, trying to calm her brother down. "We're here to fight for our rights." But he was already looking at the police officers who were beginning to line up, ready for action. This wasn't just a standoff, this was the moment when they could lose everything. She felt fear grip her heart. Suddenly, a shot was heard in the crowd. It was not a real bullet, but a sonic boom. But terror gripped the crowd. People began to panic, and at that moment, as if on command, the protesters rushed in different directions at once. Her brother instantly forgot about the opportunity to make demands and tried to break away from the crowd. She grabbed his hand and pulled him along. They were part of something important, and she wasn't going to back down. "Let's go there," she said, pointing to a secluded corner where they could hide from the police. As they made their way through the crowd, she suddenly felt her brother break free from her grip. He stopped to look at what was happening. Her heart began to beat faster. She saw other protesters running in different directions, scared and confused. "Stop!" she screamed. "Don't go!" But he was already surrounded by other protesters, all of whom were growing angry. She couldn't afford to lose him. As she moved quickly toward him, she saw police officers begin to tear gas protesters. The air reeked of chemicals, and the crowd began to panic even more. People grabbed each other, trying to get away from the gas, but not everyone made it. She saw several people fall over, unable to breathe. It all happened so fast. She rushed to her brother, then looked around again, trying to find a safe place, when a new threat appeared in the crowd. There were screams and sounds of struggle not far from them. She noticed several people on the ground trying to get up, but someone knocked them down with force. "Brother," she cried when he froze again. She knew she had to get him out of this crowd. But before she could reach him, they were surrounded by police. They were the same ones she had seen on video beating protesters. They began swinging their batons, forcing people to retreat. This wasn't just an attack, it was a sign that they were ready to use force. "Let's run," she shouted, grabbing his hand and pulling him along with her. They took a step back, but then she noticed that more people were surrounding them. They had become part of a human chain that stretched across the park. It was as if the crowd had realized that unity was their only weapon. She felt that they were all part of something bigger than just a protest. But suddenly her attention was drawn to the bright lights and sirens approaching from all directions. Ambulances and police cars began to gather around them. She remembered that they had walked into a trap, with those on both sides who would do anything to stop them. She noticed how the group of protesters began to split into two parts. Some were trying to push their way to the exit, while others, still eager to fight, decided to stay and fight. A feeling of uncertainty arose inside her. What to do? Stay with her brother or join those who wanted to stay and continue the fight? She noticed that her brother was squeezing her hand again. His face was full of fear and pain, but at the same time there was something else in it, determination. He seemed to have found the strength to continue. "We must stay together," he said with unusual determination. "If we separate, we lose everything. Let's go back and support those who remain." She couldn't help but smile. There was truth in his words. He had learned to take responsibility not only for himself, but for others as well. They were back in the center of things, and with that came a new energy. The strength her brother had found within himself was incredible. They returned to the center of the crowd, and soon realized that other protesters had gathered around them. Loud cries for justice echoed in their ears. Each cry was filled with hatred and a desire to fight. But at that moment, a sudden cry rang out, "Save me!" She turned around and saw several people trying to pull someone out from under the crowd. One of them was badly injured, and his screaming voice was chilling. "We need help!" she screamed, ready to rush into the crowd. But her brother stopped her again. "Wait! It's dangerous. If we go, we might get arrested or, even worse, beaten up." Her heart was beating faster and she felt fear creeping up on her. But in that moment, she remembered that they weren't here just for themselves. They were here to support each other. And if she could help this person, she would do whatever it took. "I can't just watch," she said, looking into her brother's eyes. "This is the moment when we must show humanity." Her brother hesitated, but eventually nodded. They rushed into the crowd together, and when they reached the wounded man, she noticed that his face was familiar. It was one of the men from the previous meetings. He was always the one who supported them. "Are you okay?" she asked, leaning toward him as his brother helped him up. He was breathing heavily, but his eyes were shining with determination. "I'm okay, I need a little help," he said, and it was like his last wish. There was shouting and noise from behind. The police were advancing again. The people around them were panicking and trying to get away, but she couldn't leave him there. Her brother and several other protesters grabbed the wounded man and they quickly began moving towards the exit. But then something unexpected happened. Suddenly, young people with cameras and microphones appeared on the street. They were part of an independent news channel that was covering the protests. This was their chance. "We're here to get your story," one of the reporters shouted when he saw them. "We know what's going on. Give us your stories." It was a moment when they could come together, when their fight gained new strength. Everyone began to gather around the camera, and she felt the energy of the crowd increase again. Protesters began to share their stories, expressing their pain and frustration. But as they neared the exit, something unexpected changed the course of events. Another crowd of protesters had gathered around them, and once again their hearts sank as they noticed police cars coming around the corner. These weren't just regular patrol cars, these were special forces vehicles. They were moving toward them like predators, surrounding their victims, ready to act. With no escape route cut off, the protesters' hearts began to pound, knowing that their time was running out. "We can't stay here," she screamed, turning to her brother and the wounded man. "We have to move." But her voice was drowned out by the cries of panic that were heard all around her. People were starting to retreat, huddling together, creating a sense of complete confusion. She felt fear creeping up on her again. Her thoughts were racing. They couldn't afford to panic. Her brother, sensing her anxiety, tightened his grip on her hand. "We can handle this," he said confidently. "If we're together, we can get through this." They finally made it to the exit, but they came across a group of police officers blocking the way. The excitement in the air became almost palpable, and it made their hearts beat faster. The crowd of protesters were terrified, not knowing what to do next. Suddenly, one of the reporters took the floor again. This time his voice sounded with increased tension. "People, we are not here to give up. Let's become a united front. If we fight together, they won't be able to stop us." These words pierced the crowd. The protesters began chanting, "We are together, we are together." This feeling of unity filled the air, and even in the midst of fear and panic, new hope arose. Then she turned her attention to the wounded man. He seemed to have forgotten the pain for a moment, and his eyes were shining with determination. "If we move in a single stream, maybe we can break through," he said, looking at the others. It was a bold proposal, and the crowd, filled with emotion, nodded in agreement. They began to move together as one, trying to escape the trap the police had created. She felt her brother supporting her, his determination giving her strength. They were part of a powerful stream of people who rushed towards the police to voice their demands. This was not just a clash, it was a manifestation of the power they had dreamed of. The cries of the protesters filled the air, "Justice, justice." At this point, the police began to insist on suppressing the riot, and a loud cracking sound filled the air. Sound grenades exploded, creating a sense of chaos. but the protesters, increasingly united, continued to move forward. And then, just when they felt themselves retreating again, there came a sound that pierced them to the depths of their souls, the sound of smoke bombs exploding. White clouds of smoke enveloped the crowd, but the protesters kept moving. This was not just a fight, it was a symbol of their resilience. And then she noticed her brother breaking away from the crowd and starting to move towards the police. It was unexpected and astonishing. "What are you doing?" she screamed, following him. "I want them to hear me," he replied, looking into the policeman's eyes. There was a fire in his eyes, and it wasn't just a desire, it was a need to be heard. He began to speak, and his voice sounded confident. "We are not here to cause trouble. We are here to claim our rights. We will not remain silent while we continue to be ignored." And his words, filled with sincerity, had an effect. Some of the policemen seemed to soften, and she noticed them freeze in place, as if trying to figure out what was happening. This was their chance, he had gotten to them. At this point, the protesters began to unite and their voices became even louder. They began to sing, their melody filling the air, and it was like a powerful cry for justice. But then something terrible happened. One of the policemen, despite her brother's words, stepped forward with a baton in his hands, and this was a portent. The crowd wavered again, afraid. "No!" she screamed, breaking through to her brother. It all happened in an instant. The policeman raised his baton and rushed at his brother, but at that moment someone else from the crowd jumped forward to protect him. It was the wounded man they had tried to save. He rushed like an angel and stood between them, shouting, "Stop! We are here to talk, not for violence." His words stopped the policeman, but it was only a temporary solution. They knew they were on the edge. And then her brother was back on his feet, looking into the eyes of the policeman who was about to hit them. "We are not your enemies. We are people, and we just want justice. Don't make us confront you." For a moment, everything froze. The policeman seemed to be thinking. It was the only thing they could do: show humanity, try to find common ground. But at this point, the crowd noticed that the situation was getting heated. The protesters began chanting even louder, and their shouts made the police nervous. Terror gripped the atmosphere, and at this point, one of the protesters, sensing that the situation was getting out of control, threw a bottle towards the police. This was the last straw. The police began to act, using force. Loud cries for justice turned into cries of panic. Everything became chaos in an instant. Bullets flew into the air, tear gas filled the space, and the protesters, unable to breathe, began to run away. She held her brother's hand, trying not to lose him in this horror. "We have to get out of here," she screamed, but the crowd had huddled together again, creating complete chaos. And at that moment, an unexpected turn occurred. Suddenly, someone from the back of the crowd shouted, "Look, this is our chance." She turned around and saw a group of people standing at a distance decide to intervene. They were young activists from different organizations who had come to help when things started to get worse. They began to form a chain and protect the protesters from the police, using shields and protective gear. "Come to us," they shouted. "We won't let you fall." It was unexpected. She felt hope begin to grow. Their appearance inspired the protesters, and they began to gather together to get out of this trap. "Brother, we can do it," she cried out to him. And at that moment, she realized that they could still change the course of events. Together with her brother, they rushed to the activists, hoping that this unexpected turn would help them survive this nightmare. When they found themselves among the activists, everything around them was filled with new energy. Together, they began to form a human chain, helping other protesters escape the trap created by the police. It was a true act of solidarity. They could not give up as long as they were together. And so, as the crowd moved towards safety, they realized that this fight for justice would not end today. It would be a long fight, but they were part of something bigger. Their voices, their stories, they would live on, and they would not allow anyone to dim their light. The moment they finally reached safety, the crowd of protesters gathered together and her brother raised his voice again. "This is not the end. This is just the beginning. We will fight for justice until each of us is heard." And there was truth in that cry. They were united not only by fear, but also by hope, and they knew that together they could overcome any obstacle. When they finally emerged from the conflict zone, tired and scared but still determined, the crowd of protesters had gathered in a safe place where the sounds of gas and police shouts were gradually fading. She and her brother were finally able to catch their breath. Around them stood people with tired but hopeful faces. Each of them carried their own story, their own suffering, and their own dreams of justice. The group began to share what had happened, and she realized that they were all part of one big tragedy. In those moments of fear, violence, and pain, they opened their hearts to each other. Some had wounds, some had tears, and some had rage burning in their eyes. Among them, she saw a woman who was crying. She went up to her and asked what had happened. The woman, with tears in her eyes, told her about her son, who had been arrested at a protest, simply for trying to speak his mind. He was only a teenager, and it turned out he had been detained without being given a chance to explain himself. He just wanted to be heard. The woman sobbed. It's not his fault he was born black. The words cut deep. She thought of her own brother, and how easily the world could take away his freedom simply because he was black. She understood that racism permeated every aspect of life. From police brutality to workplace discrimination, it was a system built on fear and bias, and they seemed never to be able to escape its clutches. A crowd began to gather around, and soon they began sharing their stories, expressing their feelings and anger. Each shared their experiences, how they were denied the right to vote, how they were insulted because of the color of their skin, how they had to put up with daily discrimination. These stories of acute pain sounded like echoes of their reality, and it united them all. She realized that there was something more to their shared suffering. It was an opportunity to come together, to be heard. The gathering revived their resolve to continue the fight. Despite what had happened, they knew they had to act. Meanwhile, her brother stood up and gave a speech full of passion and determination. We can't put up with this any longer. We must continue to fight for our rights. We are not only defending ourselves, we are defending everyone who has fallen victim to this system. His words filled the air. She saw the faces of the people around her fill with hope. They began to chant again, but with a new intent. They weren't just expressing anger. They were going to act. The next day, the protesters decided to hold a peaceful march in a local park. It was supposed to be a day of unity, where they could show that racism had no place in their community. They planned to call on everyone to come and support them, blacks, whites, people of all races and ethnicities. It was supposed to be a unifying event that would let everyone know that they would not give up. But as the day drew closer, her heart grew anxious. She knew the protests could backfire. The police had already expressed their displeasure at the planned march, threatening consequences for those who decided to participate, and she feared for her brother, for everyone who would take to the streets. When the day of the march arrived, she couldn't help but feel the tension building. There was hope, but also fear. People began to gather in the park, and soon it was overflowing. Thousands of protesters with signs, shouting and playing music. They were determined to show their hatred of racism, to express their willingness to fight for justice. But, as expected, the crowd attracted the attention of local police. They began to set up cordons, and when the protesters began moving through the streets, the police began to follow them like predators ready to pounce. As the procession reached the city's main square, the situation became tense. Suddenly, she noticed several police officers moving forward, and this boded ill. "Brother," she cried, trying to get to him in the crowd, "we need to stay together." But when she reached him, she saw him get down on one knee, ready to make a speech. His voice was full of determination, and he spoke words that made her heart flutter. "We are here to show that we have a voice. We will not remain silent." But as soon as he finished, shouts of "back, back," could be heard from the crowd. The police began to advance with batons and shields, and it was only a matter of time before a clash occurred. Anxiety gripped the crowd. People began to panic, and she felt fear fill her heart again. They couldn't afford to give in, not this time. "Stand together," she shouted, gathering the protesters around her. "We can't let them divide us." The crowd shouted again, their voices filling the air. "Justice, justice." It was like magic, and she felt the power of their unity overwhelm her. But at that moment, an unexpected turn of events occurred. One of the police officers, apparently, could not stand the tension and swung his baton. This became the trigger. Panic began in the crowd, and the protesters, trying to save themselves, ran in different directions. She felt her brother's grip slip. His hand slipped from hers, and in that instant she lost sight of him. "Brother!" she screamed, trying to push her way back into the crowd. Her heart was pounding with fear. She had been looking for him, but instead she found herself in the middle of chaos. Screams and sounds of struggle filled the air, and everything around them seemed unreal. People fell, fighting for their lives, while police officers with batons tried to suppress the protesters. She saw one of them run up to the girl who was falling to the ground and start hitting her. It was terrible. She realized she had no choice. She couldn't stand by when her brother might need help. She knew she had to find him. Gathering her strength, she rushed into the crowd, heading in the direction where she had last seen him. Every step was filled with fear, but determination burned in her heart. She could not allow herself to give up. Finally, after several long moments, she saw him. He stood surrounded by other protesters, their faces full of pain and fear, but in her brother's eyes she saw something else, hope. He was trying to help the wounded man on the ground, and that filled her with pride. "Brother!" she screamed, making her way towards him, but suddenly the police appeared in front of them, and her heart sank. "Get out of the way!" one of them shouted, waving a club. She felt a cold terror wash over her. Her brother seemed oblivious to the danger. "We're not going to leave," he shouted back, standing his ground as if this was his last battle. At that moment, something amazing happened. The crowd of protesters he had inspired began to gather around him, forming a wall of bodies ready to protect their leader. "We are together," they shouted. "We will not remain silent." But at that moment, when everything seemed almost perfect, one of the policemen raised his baton and hit her brother. It was unexpected, and the crowd recoiled in horror. "No!" she screamed, feeling her heart breaking. She rushed forward, but the crowd blocked her, and her body was trapped in panic and fear. She couldn't stop, couldn't leave her brother in this situation. Every scream around her grew louder, mixing with the noise and chaos. She felt her chest tighten with terror as her brother fell to the ground, his body colliding with the asphalt, and panic began all around. The police, as if blinded by their power, continued to use force. The loud screams of the protesters cut into her consciousness, but all she heard was her brother. "No!" she screamed, pushing her way through the crowd. She finally managed to get to the front, but the police continued to advance, swinging their batons. They were breaking through the crowd, and she saw several people being knocked down. At that moment, her brother rose to one knee, his face contorted in pain. He looked at her with genuine fear in his eyes. "Get out of here," he shouted, but there was determination in his voice as well as alarm. "Save yourself." She couldn't believe she was hearing such words. "I won't leave you," she replied, moving closer to him despite the threats around her. Around them, the crowd of protesters who had seemed to be losing hope began to gather again, their faces full of anger and determination. They stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to protect each other, but the pressure from the police was growing. As she fought the crowd, thoughts began to form in her mind about how they, as black people, were the ones who suffered from systemic racism. She thought about the times she and her brother had been subjected to bias, how their own family had been discriminated against, how their father had lost his job simply because of the color of his skin. They were fighting not only for themselves, but for their ancestors, for every victim of the racism that continued to plague their community. She looked at her brother again. His face was pale and his eyes were full of pain. "Can you stand up?" she asked, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, he began, but his voice shook. He looked at her again, determination in his eyes. "We must continue." The crowd around them filled with cries for justice, and they raised their hands again as one. This moment of unity, when they all became one, gave her strength. But the policemen weren't going to back down. They started moving forward again, and among them she saw one of them raising his weapon. At that moment, everything around her froze. Her heart froze in her chest. "Get out of the way," one of the policemen shouted. his voice loud and threatening. The protesters, in a situation of fear, began to retreat, and the crowd began to lose its former spirit. She knew that this could be the end, but she could not let it happen. "No!" she screamed, addressing everyone around her. "We can't give up." But her scream was drowned out by the chaos, and she felt fear creeping up on her again. Meanwhile, her brother, sensing her despair, raised his hand and said, "Listen, we are here to talk. We are not our enemies." His voice was full of power, and the protesters began to gather around him again. They felt his determination, and it filled them with hope. At this point, one of the protesters, noticing what was happening, began to shout, "We must protect each other. We must stand together." The crowd became more emboldened, and they began to form a human chain, forming a shield against the advancing police. It was something amazing, ordinary people standing in a row, raising their hands and creating a barrier to protect their brothers and sisters. "We won't let you break us," another protester shouted, joining his brother. "We're here to stand up for our rights." And that was the trigger for the crowd. The protesters began chanting, "Justice, justice." Their voices merged into a powerful chorus that sounded like it could move mountains. Suddenly, amidst the chaos, sirens blared in the distance. Ambulances. The people at the edge of the crowd began to rise, their attention drawn to the approaching vehicles. This created a new wave of panic, but her brother, wasting no time, raised his voice again. "This is our chance. We need to help those who suffered." Gathering her strength, she looked at her brother and nodded. They all knew this was their moment. They had to help others, even if it meant facing the police. The crowd began to move again. As protesters began to move the wounded to safety, she saw one of her friends run up to the wounded man and begin administering first aid, while others continued to form a protective circle around them. It was a true show of unity. The protesters, despite their fear, were fighting not only for themselves, but for those in distress. They knew their lives mattered and would not let racism destroy them. But before they could finish their aid, the police began to advance again. It was a violent clash, and a sense of unease hung in the air. "Stand next to me," the brother shouted, raising his hands to stop the people. She saw the determination burning in his eyes, and it gave her strength. "We must stick together," she said as people began to gather into a tight circle. And then, when they raised their hands again, there was an unexpected twist. One of the police officers, apparently deciding that further action was unacceptable, returned to the car and pulled out something from the back. It was a shield with the logo of the local police. "Stop!" he shouted as the other police officers began to prepare for their next move. The crowd froze. This could be the beginning of more violence, and the tension in the air was palpable. She realized that things might not turn out as they had hoped. But her brother, not wanting to give up, raised his voice again. "We are not your enemies. We just want to be heard." For a moment, everything froze. The policeman with the shield exchanged glances with the others, and she felt hope slowly begin to fill her heart. Maybe they could come to some kind of agreement. Maybe all was not lost. But it was just an illusion. The crowd, realizing that the situation was heating up, began to panic again. "We have to leave," someone from the crowd shouted, and the protesters began to move in different directions. "Stop!" she shouted, trying to gather the people back. "We need to stay together." And at that moment the police began to move. Her brother came to her defense again, and she felt his confidence giving her strength. "We can't give up," he said, and the crowd froze again. But at that moment the policeman who was holding the shield raised his voice again. "If you don't disperse, we will use force." That was the last straw. She felt fear creeping into her heart again. How could they have gotten to the point where they were being threatened? Gathering her strength, she looked at her brother and shouted, "We can't give up." And to her surprise, the protesters began to rise, uniting again into one. "We will not remain silent," they shouted. "We will fight for justice." And at that moment, something amazing happened. People began to take steps forward, ready to show the police that they would not submit. It was not just a movement forward. It was a statement, powerful, proud, and full of determination. The crowd shouted again, "Justice, justice." The cry came like a bolt from the blue. Each voice reinforced the other, and together they created more than just noise. They created a wave that could change everything. The police officers, confronted by this powerful group, were momentarily taken aback. You could see doubt in their eyes. They expected the protesters to run away in fear, but instead they saw determination and strength. "We will not remain silent," her brother shouted again, and his voice became a symbol of their unity. She felt a fire burning in her heart. They were on the threshold of something more than a protest. They were part of a movement that could change society, break the chains that bound them, and give them back the dignity that had been taken from them. The police took a step forward, and amid the general panic, one of the protesters shouted, "Stay where you are. This is not the way." This cry became a signal for the others. They began to form a chain, putting their arms around each other's shoulders, creating a protective barrier to protect those who might be in danger. She saw how people united into one powerful force, how they took each other's hands and stood up to the authorities. Amidst the general shouting and panic, voices emerged that began to gather the protesters. These were the ones who realized the importance of their struggle. They began to explain that violence would not solve the problem, that they must strive for peace, for dialogue. It was not an easy decision, but in their hearts there was hope for change. "We have to show that we are a community, that we can come together," one of the leaders said, raising his hand. "We can start to change the situation if we act together." This call encouraged the people. The crowd began to calm down, and the flame of hope was lit in their eyes again. She felt her brother beside her regaining confidence. But they knew there could be more hardships ahead. Her heart beat in unison with the protesters. She knew this battle was not just for her brother, but for every soul who had ever faced prejudice and hatred. The police, watching the protesters begin to unite, took action. They took another step forward, raising their shields and batons. It was a clear warning, and the air was filled with tension. "Stop!" one of the policemen shouted again, and this caused a new wave of fear among the protesters. "We are not your enemies," she screamed back, feeling the anger rise inside her. "We just want to be heard." But at that moment another policeman, more senior in rank, approached them and raised his hand, as if demanding silence. He said, "We can resolve this peacefully. We are ready to listen, but you need to separate." These words created a moment of silence. The protesters looked at each other, and a glimmer of hope appeared in their eyes. They expected that this policeman really wanted to hear them. "We are here to speak, to share our stories," she said, stepping forward. "We will not tolerate this lawlessness any longer. We want you to understand that we are not just the color of our skin. We are our dreams, our rights, our dignity." The crowd began to support her again, and soon her words filled the space. "Justice. We want justice." Every word they spoke became a powerful weapon, and their hopes seemed to become even more evident. The police standing in front of them began to retreat, and there were whispers among them about a possible dialogue. But that moment of vulnerability was quickly lost. A cry of discontent rose from the crowd of protesters. One protester, angry and ready for action, threw a plastic bottle at the police. The moment froze as the bottle flew past. She saw the police officers react immediately to the throw, one of them raising his baton, and then everything fell into chaos again. "No!" she screamed, but it was too late. A fight broke out. The police began to disperse the crowd, using rubber bullets and gas, and it was a real nightmare. People began to run away, but she couldn't leave her brother. She felt fear grip her heart again, but at the same time, determination flared up inside her. She couldn't let this terror get the better of her. "Brother!" she screamed, trying to push her way through the crowd, her voice echoing the cries of other protesters. She grabbed his hand, and at that moment something in her soul changed. "We can't give up," she said as they began to retreat back, taking cover from the police. "We have to be stronger." The brother nodded, and despite their fear, they began to move towards the exit. Behind them they could hear screams and sounds of struggle, but they knew they had to get out and find a safe place. When they finally emerged from the crowd, they saw that protesters were everywhere, some trying to help the wounded, some simply seeking shelter from police violence, but there was still hope in their eyes. "We need to unite," she said when they finally found shelter in a nearby park. "We can't afford to give up." The brother nodded, and they decided that they needed to gather with the rest of the protesters to discuss what to do next. This day was more than just a protest. It was an act of strength that would live in their hearts forever. They knew the fight was just beginning, but now they knew they weren't alone. They were part of something bigger, part of a movement that was seeking justice, and their voices were louder than ever. As the protesters gathered in the park, the air was filled with unity and hope. Their faces were full of determination, and each of them understood that their fight was not just for themselves, but for a future in which everyone would be heard, regardless of the color of their skin. She and her brother stood in the center of the group, and other protesters approached them to share their stories. One by one, they shared stories of bias, violence they had faced, loss and grief. Each story was powerful and moving, and soon the park was filled with tears and cries of support. "We have to make a plan," said one of the protest leaders, a tall guy holding a microphone. "We can't let this moment get overshadowed. We need to be heard." The crowd agreed and began to discuss various ways to attract the attention of society and the authorities. They decided to organize a meeting with local officials to discuss the issues that were bothering them. It was important to create a dialogue to talk about their experiences and sufferings in order to change the situation. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. She remembered how their voice had been ignored more than once, and doubt arose in her soul again. However, when she looked at her brother, she felt that she couldn't let fear take over. "We can do this," she said confidently, and her brother nodded, giving her strength. That evening, protesters began handing out flyers and spreading information about the gathering. They created a hashtag for social media, encouraging people to share their stories to demonstrate the scale of the problem. The day was more than just a protest. It was the beginning of a movement that would sweep across the city. A few days passed, and the meeting with local officials was well attended. Each speaker shared their experiences, and their voices came together as one, united in their desire for justice. She saw officials sitting with serious faces, listening to stories that might have gone unnoticed before. Finally, one of the officials stood up to speak. "We hear you. We understand that this is an important issue, and we are committed to working to improve the situation. We will begin a program to train our employees on how to deal with racial bias, and we will work to create a safe environment for everyone." The crowd burst into applause. They knew it was just the beginning, but they felt their struggle was beginning to bear fruit. But most importantly, she realized that this would be a long road. There were still many obstacles ahead, and racism could not be eradicated with one solution. However, in that moment, she realized, together, they could overcome any obstacle. It was a moment that changed not only their lives, but the lives of many others. Months passed, and they continued their work, pushing for change. The protests became regular, and more people joined their movement. Every time they gathered, she remembered the day her brother was trapped in a car, and how it spurred them to fight for justice. One day, after another protest, she and her brother decided to take a walk in the park. There was a freshness in the air, and they enjoyed the moment, knowing that they could be themselves. "You know, I think we did something important," she said, looking at her brother. "Yes," he agreed, "but we must continue to work. This is just the beginning." They smiled at each other, and a light of hope burned in their hearts. They knew there was still work to be done, but now they had a community to support them. This was more than just a protest. It was a movement that continued to grow and evolve. Every step, every protest, every gathering brought them closer to the dream of a more just world. They knew that together they could create change. With each passing day, they became more confident that their voices would be heard and their dreams would become reality. And so, with confidence in their hearts and hope for the future, they continued their fight for justice, for equality, for the life that everyone deserves, regardless of the color of their skin. Dear viewers, what do you think of our story? We would love to hear your opinion in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? How did you deal with such situations? Your stories are important to us and can inspire others. We appreciate each of you and your support. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Have a great day and see you soon.